Living as a neurodivergent person in a world designed for neurotypicals can feel really overwhelming at times. But you're not alone. Imagine a space where you can connect, understand, and heal, giving attention and care to those parts of you that need it the most. I want to invite you to join us from anywhere in the world for this 6-week neurodivergent support group, where we will use IFS therapy to explore and embrace the different parts of you. Learn how to recognize your inner strengths, face your challenges with compassion, and create deeper connections with others who generally understand. Together, we can create a space where every part of you feels heard, valued, and empowered. Spots are limited to 8 for this support group, so sign up today if you want to be a part of this supportive, transformational experience.
Welcome back, everyone. So sorry we are a little late on getting this third episode in our series on neurodiversity to you, but we are here and we are so excited to have this conversation. And we have a special guest for this episode. This episode is all about heal versus accommodate. And this is a question that we've asked many times and that other folks are asking, trying to understand what's the right expectation here? Can I expect this part of me or this part of my partner to be able to be resolved issue potentially, or is this something that needs to be accommodated and supported? And it's not always clear. So we're not going to bring you crystal clear clarity today, but we're hoping to maybe illuminate this conversation and help you get your wheels turning on your own scenario and your partnership as well. So we are going to introduce you to Jodi Carlton. She is a leading world expert in mixed neurotype relationship dynamics and communication. Her personal and direct style of educating and coaching is a favorite with all neurotypes around the globe. Her unique blend of personal and professional experience with neurodiverse relationships positions her to help people with a blame-free mindset and a goal of clarity, which is why we love her. We've been following her for a while now and enjoying her content so much, and just felt like we kind of struck gold when we found you, Jodi. We were like, no way, someone exists that brings all of this into the conversation. So
Yeah.
welcome to Fill the Flourish podcast.
I'm really excited to talk to you guys, and I'm so glad that we found each other. That's mutual. I love what you guys are doing for the world and for the community as well. So I think together we're stronger.
That's right. I love that.
For
That's
sure.
your mindset too.
Mm.
All right. Well, let's jump into this complicated conversation. Why don't we start? Both Luke and Jodi can kind of give us a idea of what type of characteristics and conditions would be more classically considered trauma and what would be more considered neurodivergent characteristics. And then the third category, what are often both?
Okay, so again, thanks for having me here, you guys. So just to clarify, yes, I work with neurodiverse couples primarily now. I've done a lot of work as a therapist over time in trauma as well. So let's talk about what some of the traits and characteristics of trauma. And a lot of people, well, that word's thrown around really lightly. And there's a difference between trauma and just basic challenges and struggles and pain and heartache. Trauma is something that really gets it changes the brain. So the brain basically has the capacity to protect self-preservation, protect us when there's a perceived danger. It's our whole fight or flight response system. There's also fawning, which is people pleasing, and freezing, just kind of freezing up. And it's a very important part of how we're wired as human beings. That system is not a problem. It's a lot of people think of the fight or flight response as something that's wrong, but actually it's something that's very right because it keeps us safe. And so whenever we experience heartbreak or heartache or challenges or struggles or really difficult people, then that fight or flight, that mechanism kicks in to help alert us to potential safety, not just physical, but emotional, psychological, any kind of danger, really. And so that doesn't feel good. It's very uncomfortable. It's and it's supposed to be. It's just like when you feel pain, if you cut yourself, you're supposed to feel the pain, and that's your body's way of alerting you that something's wrong and you need to attend to it right away. So the difference between that mechanism, that fight, flight, fawn, freeze response, with what then causes what we call trauma in the brain is when you have a singular incident, which is in and of itself very traumatic, which usually we look at where there's risk of life or severe extreme danger to self or someone you love, or even you can witness that something remotely from watching news or something on the news. That's more of an acute trauma. And then chronic trauma is when we're exposed to things repeatedly over the course of time. This is more what we see in the case of someone who's in an abusive or neglectful environment. So trauma, then what our brain does is it rewires itself to manage this traumatic type of experience. With an acute trauma, the brain starts to anticipate that this is a potential thing that could happen. So the brain rewires and uses things like dissociation, which helps disconnect us from our emotions, different types of strategy, shutdowns, avoidance, things that help basically motivate us either internally, psychologically, or motivate our behavior to keep us safe. So that just is a very quick trauma 101, and then we're going to get into that even more as we talk today. But let me just briefly talk about neurodiversity, because the neurodivergent brain, neurodiversity is a neurotype. It's not a response to the environment. However, when we often see that people who are born neurodivergent with that genetic wiring to be neurodivergent, which means there are traits that are different from the most commonly occurring traits in the human population, traits and characteristics in terms of how the brain thinks, experiences feeling, experiences sensation, all the cognition. There are differences. That neurodivergent brain is more susceptible to trauma. And it's so basic because it is a different kind of brain. Sometimes sensory thresholds are much lower than neurotypical brains. So certain sensations can become very uncomfortable, even painful, much sooner than for a neurotypical brain. So the brightness of lights or the loudness of sounds, the suddenness of sounds, the texture of fabrics against our skin, touch from a person or even objects, taste. My daughter had a lot of difficulty with food textures and had trouble learning how to eat. And we almost had to give her a feeding tube because she was so underweight. And it was like her brain couldn't process those sensations and she had trouble eating, which then can result in a defensiveness, oral defensiveness, which is a trauma type of response, an avoidance. She couldn't even tolerate having certain textures of foods on her plate. We had to take her to this food clinic where she'd throw it away. She couldn't even tolerate looking at it, which was a trauma response because her brain's like, that's going to make me gag if I put it in my mouth. So neurodivergent individuals, as their brains are developing and they're growing up, are more likely to have their brain experience things as trauma, which then causes it to rewire and can contribute to some of the behaviors which is not necessarily wired in, but it's a behavioral response to the environment, where some of the avoidant type of behaviors, just defensiveness types of behaviors, with retreat, withdrawal type of behaviors. So anyway, that's kind of just a real quick rundown, and then we can get into that even more with the two of you and your expertise and knowledge in trauma and neurodivergence and the body. Because Lauren, I know you also have one of your specializations is to help calm that nervous system down, which it's the nervous system that's getting fired up, as part of that fight or flight response.
Such a good job explaining that. And even as you were describing some of the things that your daughter was struggling with, it's just so fascinating. The more we learn about neurodivergence, it's just the different ways that it can be expressed with different people. Like we talk about when you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. Well, there's this kind of goes back into our conversation, at least maybe jumps ahead into our conversation, but as we were talking, there's like, I didn't realize this, but there's like textures and foods that I look at and want to gag. But like
Mhm.
I have just pushed through that because that wasn't okay. And then I just think about like my anxiety growing up. Um, this was like helpful and unhelpful. I had anxiety, but it was never acknowledged and wasn't space for it. So I just pushed through it, which helped me do a lot of things that I probably wouldn't have done. But
Mhm.
it's also created other traumas, a sense of not feeling like I can use my voice, being in touch with my emotions, being very disconnected. And so, I mean, again, I could be jumping ahead, but this is where my brain's going. So this is where I'm going to go. And we run this podcast, so we get to do what we want, right?
Yes.
Um, well, how do we know when to heal and when to accommodate? Because my brain goes, I didn't accommodate, and that helped me in some ways, but it harmed me in other ways. And there's like both and. So it's just, I don't know if that question
Mhm.
makes sense, but I just want to,
It does to me.
that's what
And
that
so
came up as you were talking.
I think it's a perfect segue. Honestly, you're saying we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I think it's a perfect segue to talk about the concept of accommodating ourselves, accommodating our partners, our children, our family members, accommodating versus healing. So healing, accommodating is more about what do we do in response to what our brain or our behavior, our body is telling us that we need. Um, Healing, though, is about helping the brain understand I'm safe because the trauma response is about safety. It's about I'm not safe. I'm not safe. And
Hmm.
so the defense mechanisms kick in. So accommodating is recognizing what our body needs and basically honoring ourselves, our boundaries, telling ourselves, I'm going to honor that. I'm going to honor what my body needs and also help my brain to learn that I have the ability to honor what I need, which is what gives us safety. The
Hmm.
safety is in us being able to set those boundaries for ourselves. So as a child, we don't have a lot of power. We don't have a lot of control. We are at the mercy of our caregivers. And we can have great caregivers or we can have caregivers that are not so great. And even great caregivers, though, may not really understand what a neurodivergent child's body is needing. And so a lot of
Absolutely.
parents unknowingly force their children to do things that their body is saying it's causing their body is screaming no. And parents may not realize how painful or uncomfortable something is for a child, but they're teaching them social politeness. For example, like we'll talk to about my daughter again. She's 22, she's autistic, was diagnosed when she was 5. I used to tell her, look at me. And I'd literally use my fingers. I'd be like, look at me. And I don't know if I've told you guys this story or not. And if I have, I'll just say it again. Um, but because socially, she didn't make eye contact much at all. She was just very not. She just didn't. And so I'd say, look at me. And over time, and it was hard for her. She would look at me, and then I'd realize she would do this, and she was couldn't hear a word I was saying. She wasn't really focusing on what I was trying to communicate. She was just trying to look at me because it was so uncomfortable. And I realized after a while, I probably did that for years though, before I realized she can concentrate on what I'm saying better if she's not looking at me because she's so uncomfortable. That's wasn't necessarily physically painful for her, but it was definitely very uncomfortable for her and difficult for her because then she would also she still wouldn't necessarily she wouldn't process what I was saying. Then she might get in trouble because she didn't follow through with some instruction. So then she associates that looking at me with discomfort and consequence. And so then over time that can cause maybe not trauma. I don't think she was traumatized by that specific thing. But
Sure.
if you think about a lot of the other sensory demands and needs of a neurodivergent brain, where you've got clothes that are so uncomfortable, tags and just different textures that can literally For a neurotypical person, an analogy might be if you have clothes that are rubbing blisters everywhere on your body and you're having to wear them every day, day in and day out, that's so painful. But you can't
Yeah.
necessarily, you can't see a blister there, but the experience of the clothing is the same nonetheless. That type of
Yeah.
experience could cause trauma in a neurodivergent brain because of the
Sure.
just chronic exposure to it. I feel like I'm going down a tangent here too. Luke, did you want to, or do either one of you want to jump in and just add to what I'm saying here?
I think it's so helpful, Jodi, that you are sharing with our listeners the reality, and they've studied this, and there's evidence pointing to this, that neurodivergent nervous systems can be traumatized more easily. Because I think if you're neurotypical, like you're saying, the food, the clothes, like just because your experience as a neurotypical mom or partner or whatever doesn't feel that is literally irrelevant to what they feel. And something that I've just been so humbled by as a neurotypical person, have worked to understand my neurodivergent partner, my neurodivergent children, is like, just because it's not my experience doesn't make it any less valid or any less real. And it really takes a lot of mental intentionality to put yourself in their shoes and say, what would I, like you said, if there were blisters on my body, would I want to wear those clothes?
Mm-hmm.
And in the midst of frustrations, we don't have a lot of access to empathy, anyone, no matter what neurotype. So if you're frustrated with your partner, frustrated with yourself, even if you're experiencing that, you're all wrapped up in like that fight or flight response and resistance of what is. You're not going to be able to access empathy of, oh, well, this is a real experience. How do I respond in light of knowing this is real? Like, it sounds so simple, but really honoring that it is a real lived experience, and then how to respond, and knowing that neurodivergent bodies will, their threshold is different. So because of their nervous system's ability to take in so much, their likelihood of having constant overwhelm
Mm-hmm.
in their nervous system that kind of spills over into, actually, like you said, it becomes a traumatic thing. This neutral stimuli becomes traumatic.
Yep.
And that's just so important to know if you want to understand as a neurotypical person, or even like Jodi, if you want to share your neurotype and your larger experience with neurodivergence too. We should probably have done that at the beginning, but I forgot to ask you. Even as a different neurotype, you might not understand another neurotype's experience, or even the same neurotype as you that just has a different expression of their neurodivergence.
Yes, which really speaks to cognitive empathy theory of mind, where we really don't know, we can't ever know what someone else is actually experiencing because their experience is so different than ours. I'm ADHD, and you're absolutely right. I'm ADHD. My daughter's autistic. My son's ADHD. I understand him more because we're both those dopamine seekers. We have the dopamine seeking brain, whereas my daughter is not ADHD. And so there are times when I literally will say to her, I can't relate to you at all. Or she'll say to me, I can't relate to you at all. The important part there's no judgment in that statement. It's not like I can't relate to that. It's more of like, I really genuinely can't relate to what you're experiencing, but I believe you. I believe that
Yeah.
you're experiencing it, and I see that you're experiencing it. And I want to just, because that right there, I want to circle back to the trauma piece, because again, children don't have control. They don't have control over their worlds. Their parents control most of everything. And the one thing that a child the only thing a child has control over is their mind, somewhat their behavior. And so young children, neurodivergent children, develop trauma responses. I would say there's a large majority. I don't think there's any research out there on this. It needs to be done, but I'd say a large majority of neurodivergent children have some degree of trauma by the time they reach adulthood, because, or they've at least they're accommodating responses to the world. The way they've accommodated themselves is by dissociation, withdrawal, retreat. There's a lot of trauma responses in order to just to live every day, to be in the world. And when we this conversation about accommodation versus healing is so important, because as we get into adulthood, some of those accommodating behaviors that worked well in childhood, this is true for non-neurodivergent individuals who maybe grew up in a neglectful or abusive type of situation. Those accommodating behaviors that we've learned how to cope with the trauma aren't they don't work for us as well. They still work, but they can prevent us from being have a fulfilling full life, even connections with others, because of the brain wiring. Like the brain literally rewires itself to have these responses that are initially accommodating. So the conversation, when you guys reached out to me, you said, let's talk about this. What's really important in adulthood is to learn, how do I accommodate myself when I need it, but also heal my brain to let my brain know I'm safe. I can keep myself safe. And so I'm not experiencing this trauma response when it's no longer necessary. I need to teach my brain
Yeah.
I'm safe.
Yeah. Both of you were talking and about parenting, attunement, and what came up to me is like just a reminder that our listeners, like, it is important as parents that we're going to mess up. We're going to misattune to our kids. But the important thing is to keep on learning, because like I remember in grad school when my professor was saying, don't tell your kids to look at you because it's going to trigger their brain and they're going to go into that fight. Then I have an ADHD kid who, if he's not looking at me, he doesn't hear me. And
Hmm.
so I was trying to attune to him and not make him feel intimidated and scared, but his brain's out here looking at the world. So for him, I actually need him to say, look at me. And, and like, and so there isn't a one size fits all. It really is, know your kids. You are going to mess up. You're going to like, look at me. Oh, this child can't look at me. Don't look at me. No, you need to look at me. And so just that attuning. But as we're doing that as parents, we're helping our kids also learn skills, which brings us to adulthood, so that we can also learn to look at ourselves and say, what do we need to accommodate and what do we need to heal?
Hmm.
Because as you were just mentioning, Lauren and I have had this conversation, and we actually just, I think it was just even tonight. One way that I adapted was like demand avoidance. If it overwhelmed me, if it came out of nowhere, if I couldn't transition, I avoided it.
Hmm.
And or attachment style, I'm avoidantly attached. So there's that attachment and trauma, and people, I get overwhelmed relationally and socially. And I've had to, and RSD, I mean, just there's so many different ways that within a relationship, I get triggered. Um, I get afraid, I get hurt. It makes me shut down. It makes me want to pull away from Lauren. And those were adaptations that helped me through teenage years, through a childhood. But when you're as an adult or within this like a close, intimate relationship, I can't avoid. Well, I can, but it's not going to create. It's going to hurt Lauren. Like there's a this one conversation that she kept. Well, one statement she kept on saying is like, when you avoid, you trigger my anxious attachment, and so I'm scared. And I had to hear that and explore it inside of me of, okay, this is terrifying for me, but I'm also, the far longer I stay away, the more terrified she becomes. And so there is trauma and there's neurotype involved in that avoidance of conflict because of my RSD, because of attachment. There is a mixture. And I had to ask the question, I don't know if it was a question, but there had to be an awareness of the hurt that Lauren was feeling and saying, am I going to change? Or can I change?
Would you say that that specific behavior for purposes of this conversation to know like what category I'm being
Yeah.
super binary right now. But that's the title. So would you say that would be more the goal of healing versus the goal of like essentially it'd be me accommodating?
Can I jump into that?
Right.
Because I actually think I can. I have
Yeah, go ahead.
a thought about that. But Luke, I don't want to interrupt you if you had something you want to say.
Go for it.
So, okay, this concept, I think it's so important for us to look at what the root of all of this is. Attachment. You brought up attachment, avoidant attachment, insecure attachment, um, the defense mechanisms that you talked about, where rejection sensitivity dysphoria is a form of trauma response to this brain wiring that I'm going to be rejected. Um, Dissociative type responses, which is like an avoidant shutdown response. Those are all trauma responses. The root of all of this, even attachment, is safety. It's safety. That's the root of everything. And so what the goal is when you think about, you know, Luke, that example you just gave with you and Lauren, if if your body and your brain is just or not impulsively, reflexively telling you to retreat, and Lauren has shared with you when you retreat, what it does is triggers in Lauren fear, it's that lack of safety, that insecure attachment she has with you at times. I'm a little different than a lot of people when it comes to attachment theory. I don't believe we have an attachment type. I think we have attachments with people, with certain people, and we
Yeah.
tend to have patterns that we reproduce with we tend to attach in similar ways to people, but it's not like
Right.
we have an attachment style because we can be very securely attached to one person and very insecurely
Hmm.
attached to another. Um, but what happens is your whatever triggered whatever the trigger was, say between you and Lauren, and then Luke, you're reflexively retreating. Then Lauren feel fearful because that's scary when my husband, someone who loves me, is disconnecting from me, disengaging from me. Now I feel fear. When we look at accommodation and healing, the I see the difference there. First and foremost is to stop and look at what's actually happening. Am I fearful in some way? Am I fearful? Do I feel in danger in some way? And how do I tell my clients to put their thoughts on trial all the time and say, for let's say in this situation, is Lauren actually trying to hurt me? Is Luke actually abandoning me? What's my brain's responding kind of automatically, reflexively, but I need to cognitively give my brain feedback that about what's happening and to remember the root of safety. So that's the trauma response that we want to heal. We want to let the brain know I'm safe, only if it is a safe person. But that's why that's
Right.
an important question is, do I actually believe this is a safe person? I ask my clients that all the time. Do you think this person is actually trying to harm you? And a lot of times it's like, no, I really don't. Okay. Then we're dealing with a trauma response of some kind that may be triggered by behaviors that are insensitive or um, just unaware. But we want to look at, is there an actual danger to self? Then, okay, so if the answer to that is no, then we want to give our brain feedback, let our brain know I'm actually safe. But now, how do we accommodate this and so that this type of dynamic doesn't keep happening? And accommodation for me is rooted in knowing ourselves, knowing our partners, knowing ourselves, recognizing what's going on for me. Am I being triggered by a sensory thing? Is this a script that I've learned? Am I responding to is it more about a script that I've learned, or is it more about an actual bodily need? Like, does my body need something that someone is pushing on me, whether that's a sensory thing or just even an executive function, someone's requiring me to show up in a way, say something, do something, be something that I don't have the bandwidth for right now. that's when our personal boundaries come into place, where we can say, I can't do this or I won't do this right now. And the more we can know ourselves, the more we can communicate to our the people in our life. And I think accommodating, we not only accommodate ourselves, but we accommodate each other as well. So knowing ourselves, communicating those things, and then being responsive to each other. But first and foremost, safety. And I feel like I'm being really wordy here. Circling back to you, something you said, Luke, it's not just about can I or will I give Lauren what she needs to feel safe, but it's also about what's the outcome I want. Like, so for you, do I want to be connected to my wife? It's not
Right.
just about making her feel better, but I
Mhm.
want to be connected to my wife. So what can I do to facilitate that?
Absolutely. Wow, that was so well said. You might have felt wordy, but I think you did an amazing job.
Oh, good. Thank you. I did. I felt like I was just going.
I think for this conversation, I think you use the word accommodate, but in my mind, Luke, you can tell me what you're thinking. This is how words are so complicated. I would call more what you just described more on the side of healing, like being aware of what's going on inside, figuring out what you need, versus like the it's just semantics, but I'm curious what you think of this feedback. Like accommodate more of like this is a behavior that is part of their innate neurotype that we need to accept and accommodate because it's not something that is appropriate to expect them to change or expect yourself to change versus, I mean, I think in that scenario, both of those things could be happening. You kind of answered both of them in that same scenario. Like maybe they're asking me to do something that's outside of my neurotype, you know, quote abilities, as if that's a thing. But like maybe they're asking me to give this public speech or have this very scripted conversation with eye contact or blah blah blah. That is not what I'm going to do, and that's where, like you said, the boundaries could come in. And that's something that you would just need to accommodate yourself for and say no, or your partner would need to say, this is something I need to accept of you and stop trying to hope you can like heal and be a different person, essentially. Whereas the trauma of, like you said, the RSD being a trauma response in the sense of like, I'm always going to be rejected. That's not your neurotype. Like that's not your, no one is born believing that they are worthless and shameful and undeserving of connection. So yes, RSD is commonly seen among neurodivergent folks, but believing, oh, I can't give this bid because I'm going to always be rejected, that's something that can actually heal, where you don't feel that way all the time, where that's not something that is like consuming your whole world because you're so sure that they're going to reject you. Now I feel like I'm I'm not bringing in
No, no, I think you are. And I know I have some thoughts about what you're saying, but Luke, what about you?
Yeah, I do. I think this is why it's really good to have this conversation because it is so nuanced
complicated. Yeah.
and complicated. Yeah, I think safety is a really good differentiation of do I feel safe? Because safety is going to lean more to trauma, whereas like capacity, and I may not be saying this perfectly, but when you were talking, it kind of that demand avoidance part of my neurodivergence comes out. And it's like when Lauren asks me to do something that I don't feel like is my capacity or it's a hard transition, I don't not feel safe. I feel overwhelmed. And I feel like I don't know what to do and how to do these things. An executive functioning thing, it's a transitioning, yeah, I'll leave it there to try to make it clear. And as we have learned about my neurodivergence more and more and seen my capacity, Lauren may ask me to do something, but she's not going to say, okay, this weekend we have 6 things we're going to do, and you need to do them.
That's the accommodation piece.
and she
Yes.
accommodates there, and it's not something I'm going to just get over. Like before we knew I was neurodivergent, we both tried to get me to get over it, and it wasn't out of a lack of safety. It wasn't a lack of effort. My brain and my body were are just hit a limit, and when I hit that limit, I go into like ADHD shutdown, burnout. Like I am offline. And so we've learned this is a capacity. I can't ask you to do these a lot of interactions, or if you have a lot of sessions in a day, that evening, she's like, okay, more compassion or giving me space. And so that's what maybe that neurodivergent accommodation looks like. And now I'm going to maybe take this a step further, and I can also see how this could be weaponized if we're not careful. Of, hey, I had a long day. I'm not going to help with the dishes, or I'm not going to help clean up, or I'm not going to, it's been a long week. I'm not going to take the kid. Like, because some of that demand avoidance, there's definitely a part of me is like, I don't want to do these things. But I, and in the past, it was maybe a response. And I've learned sometimes I do need to push myself a little bit. And so it's like finding that balance of accommodate, but also don't take advantage, push a little bit, but still attuning and not burning yourself out. So does that make sense of how do we find
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I, instead of using the word weaponize there, I use the word outsourcing because
Okay.
I think that autistic neurodivergent, especially autistic neurodivergence, not as much ADHD, but definitely sometimes. Um, it's outsourcing. It's kind of like if I'm at capacity and it's going to be difficult for me to or I'm reaching approaching capacity, if I can get someone else to do this for me and they're willing to do it, then I'm absolutely going to take them up on it.
Mm,
And it's not a weapon in terms of in a nefarious way where an
yeah.
intent to be to shirk responsibility. It's more of a, if you're willing to do it, I'm absolutely going to give you that. I call it outsourcing. I actually got that from a client. One of my clients used that word, and I'm like, oh, I'm taking that one.
I
That
like
I'm
that.
using that. Um, I just wanted to kind of add more to what you're saying there, Luke, where
Sure.
I don't think that neurotypical individuals realize. So many neurotypical individuals talk about accommodating their autistic partner. They're accommodating, and there's a lot of resentment there. There's a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, a lot of, eventual frustration of how much I have to accommodate. I
Yeah.
don't think neurotypical individuals realize that autistics are accommodating all the time. that
Yeah.
that an autistic neurodivergent, even ADHD neurodivergent, is a neurodivergent person is born into a world that is designed for neurotypicals. So from the day they're born, they're having to show up, they're being expected and taught and pressured and pushed and punished even into compliance with neurotypical expectations. So the neurodivergent person is constantly accommodating the neurotypical from a very young age, which when that really puts such a demand on their body, that's like you described overwhelm. You said the overwhelm is not about safety, but I'm gonna actually challenge you on that a little bit
Yeah.
because I think it may not be about safety as in Lauren's trying to hurt me, but your brain is still
Nervous system.
responding.
Yeah.
Yeah, your nervous system's saying this is too much for me, and that is about a safety thing.
For
So,
sure.
yeah, so that's why those trauma responses are develop as children with for neurodivergent children, the dissociative, defensive, avoidance, demand avoidance, even those things develop in a neurodivergent child who's got so many expectations, you know, put on them. So I think it's important for neurotypical partners to understand that you are just now aware of you're aware of having to accommodate, and it's a new behavior for you to accommodate, whereas your neurodivergent partner has been accommodating all along, and know how much accommodating is going into your day-to-day life. Just
Yeah.
just showing up and living. So when that neurotypical partner feels that resentment or feels even their brain is like, this is too much for me, or they go into that nervous system activation of I'm having to do these things that is pushing me. You just said how do you balance that, Luke? And you may have been referring to something slightly different, but I think part of the balance in a relationship is recognizing how much accommodation is happening by the autistic neurodivergent person because the neurotypical is only aware of their own. And there again, that goes back to theory of mind. They're only aware of how much they themselves are accommodating and not how much. And the word accommodating is basically just responding to expectations, responding to what's, expected of you in that moment. And when we think about accommodating ourselves and healing, it goes again back to boundaries, which boundaries are not about what you tell somebody else they have to do, but it's about what you honor, what you promise, your code of honor to yourself of what, do I have enough bandwidth to follow through with this? You may need to outsource at times, but it's a matter of checking in and figuring out, am I outsourcing right now because I really don't have the bandwidth, or is it just easier? There's just, and it is so nuanced. Like you said, it's a very complicated, there's not a just black and white cut and dried. This is
Yeah.
accommodating. This is a trauma response. It's the check-in with self and is this about bandwidth? Is this about safety? Sometimes the response we get from a partner is we're being judged or shamed for the boundary we need. Then now that becomes an unsafe situation. Um, so it just, again, is this about safety, or, is this, what's the root of what's happening?
Yeah. So as you help couples, and maybe neurodivergence is like a new conversation for them, and there
Mhm.
has been a lot of outsourcing for maybe decades,
Mhm.
and that neurotypical person has had that hit their limit. How do you help people, or what do you suggest as they're transitioning into this new role of understanding, okay, there's a neurodivergent person that is like accommodating in a lot of ways in their life. Then they come home and they outsource a lot, and the neurotypical partner is just like, I'm tired of this, or I'm exhausted, or I need a partner to not outsource as much, or meet me halfway.
Yeah, one of the very first places I start with is actual expectations of the household management, expectations in terms of parenting, any children that are involved, if there are children, expectations of the relationship. So we stop and look at, okay, what are you actually, each of you, what are you expecting? What is supposed to be on a day-to-day basis? Like, because people bring all of these expectations into their lives and into their relationships, and then they're living according to those expectations. And those expectations may be fine for a single person. Maybe, I always want the dishes in the dishwasher. I always want the towel off the floor. I always want my clothes in the hamper. When you're single, you live by your expectations. But when you decide to join with another person and they have a whole other set of expectations, a lot of times people join up and don't even really ever talk about this stuff, don't even know how to talk about it, don't even know what to say, or they sometimes may have the standard, how many kids do you want, just those things, but there's so many more layers of our expectations. So I start there with couples of what are you actually expecting? What are some of these things that are being the neurotypical partner, oftentimes I've found, has a lot more, like a higher volume of expectations than the neurodivergent, especially an autistic neurodivergent partner. The autistic neurodivergent partner has, if I get this, this, and this, if life is like this, and this, then I'm good. Whereas the neurotypical partner is like, ticka, ticka, ticka. I mean, they can just all this long list of things we do and how we do it. And that carries into, even, how we manage the household are how often do we vacuum? How clean is clean in the kitchen? How many activities are the kids in? How many vacations do we go on a year? Just there's so many things that I say, let's look at those expectations. Let's look at where they came from. And let's look if they're actually, people use the word needs a lot. And I'm like, okay, hold on. What is a need versus a
Yeah.
desire, a wish, or a preference? Do
Yeah.
you need to have, sit down and watch TV or connect with your spouse every single night in order to feel connected to them? Or what is another, yeah, let's look at what you think your needs are too. And I do this with both partners, not just one, but that's where I start because so much of this demand, like the outsourcing oftentimes is the neurotypical partner has all of these expectations of how we're going to run our household, how we're going to raise our kids, how we're going to eat meals. And the neurodivergent partner's like, oh, it's way too much for me. So you go ahead. And I do tell my neurotypical partners sometimes, I'm like, if it's really important to you and it's not important to your partner, then it's on you. It's your value. And that sound, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, then my autistic partner just gets to say, so that's yours. I don't have to deal with it. And I'm like, well, yeah, they do because they're a different human being and you're choosing to be with this different human being as they are. And now if there's an alignment issue in the relationship, eventually we get to, okay, what are actual needs? What are actual, and if we have deal breaker types of things there
Can we
where
negotiate? Can we negotiate or not? Yeah.
exactly, are there ways to negotiate what I would prefer and want and do need, what you prefer and want and do need? Or a lot of people have been living for years in a fantasy relationship where they're in a relationship that they're imagining in their mind and they're not really even a partner that they've projected a lot of their own fantasy desires onto that partner and then they're not getting that and over time there's a lot of resentment and frustration and anger and I'm like, let's stop and look at who you each actually are, figure out who you are, what your expectations are, where they came from, and can we negotiate? Are we actually aligned? Can we be in attunement?
Hmm.
We have been doing this process that you're describing in such perfect detail for several years now, and it's so nice to like have the terms and the understanding of what we were innately doing before we really
Mhm.
understood Luke's neurodivergence and the kids' neurodivergence. But it's like that's one of the biggest things we've realized, and that we help other people of like that difference between need and preference, and then really letting seeing what preferences you can really just let go of. And instead of it in
Yes,
like a
yes.
death, not to say there's not grief potentially, but it actually feels, from my experiences, it's very freeing to be like, oh, this
Hmm.
ideal that I had puffed up in my mind of what a healthy family does or what it looks like, or realizing like those pressures, those societal expectations that you've internalized, really no one else cares about what's happening inside your home. Like, and if
That's
you
so true.
unhook it and let it fly away like a balloon, you can feel so much more ease and like
Hmm.
such a for years we did not have a peaceful home at all. And there's
Yeah.
complicated reasons about that, not just related to neurodivergence, but uh it's amazing how just letting things go that really are just preferences that don't work for the different neurotypes in your
Hmm.
home, it creates so much more space for that connectivity, which is really what we all want. We want to be connected and feel safe and happy in our home. It creates more
Yeah.
space for that. It's not a magic formula, but it makes room for that. And then the other thing you were saying, just how many little things like one we recently did, which we should have done years ago, and people are probably going to laugh about this, but we've always like fought over the sheet. This is so funny. Like, okay,
So
so
common though.
yeah, I think that probably makes sense. But Luke really likes the sheet to be covering him like really well. And I'm just like, the sheet can be all over wonky and I'm fine. And that's just a difference, right? It's has no moral bearing whatsoever. But in my mind, the happy couple is under the sheet together, cuddling, falling asleep with the moon coming through the window. There's the fantasy for you. So we realized that if Luke has a sheet and he also has a weighted blanket and he loves that thing, and I'm like, get that off of me. It makes me want to suffocate and it makes him feel safe and happy because we're different and that's good. So I have my sheet, he has his sheet, and we're just so happy about it. It's like this tiny little accommodation, and
Mhm.
we're so much happier in our bed. So there's been a million things like that that we've been able to find that are not hard negotiations. There are areas that are much more difficult to negotiate, but in all the ones that aren't, it's like find those solutions to create less tension. And then lastly, I just want to say, like so many of the things that are related to Luke's neurotype, like anxiety, depression, and OCD type behaviors that he's talked about before on the podcast, like those co-occurring conditions that are related to trauma, but also to neurodivergence, he has found so much um, relief from, but also this is why it's like both and he's learned how to accommodate. So his anxiety, for instance, he shared before that he takes meds for his anxiety. They're super supportive for him. And he also knows how to like balance his life now and have a rhythm and a routine that is supportive to him. And I no longer,
Mhm.
like Jodi was describing, the neurotypical with 50 points of what the house needs to look like. That was me. And so of course he was feeling more anxious with my never-ending expectations and to-do list. So it's like, okay, he's got the partner who's aware of his needs and supporting them now. Not that doesn't mean not having boundaries or expectations, but supporting appropriately, accommodating, and then him supporting his anxiety. It's like incredibly different now. He doesn't
Mhm.
have panic attacks. It's completely managed, I would say, from what we've talked about. Wouldn't you say it's managed, babe?
Oh yeah, yeah. It flares up and stuff, but it doesn't stay there. It's not crippling or controlling. It just kind
Yeah.
of flares.
And with your
Well, the
depression,
accommodations lead to healing. So
Exactly.
that's where, and I like the word responding too. So when we respond to what our bodies need, that's a form of accommodation. So we're responding to it, and that ultimately leads to healing because again, trauma response is about safety. It's the brain staying in a state of feeling hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is that constant awareness that something could be unsafe for me, and the safer our environment is, the more our bodies are able to just relax and be, then that leads to ultimate healing for the brain. I love the example you gave about the bed because that is such a the bedroom is such a common place for these different for couples to have major conflict. And when you talk about expectations, Lauren, I love that you shared, what you shared about the cuddling under the covers and the moon. I think so many people have, well, everybody has their image of what is supposed to be, of what you're supposed to be doing in the bed, sex, even, just all of it. And what y'all described about the sheets is I want to just say this is not just about neurodivergent people needing to be accommodated, because we all have our sensory preferences. And whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, you have a sensory preference in the bedroom for the texture of bedding, for the weight of bedding, the temperature of the room, the airflow in the room, the lighting in the room, the sounds in the room. All of those things affect how we rest. And in the bed is when we recharge. It's one of the most important moments of our 24-hour day is when we're in the bed. And so many neurodivergent brains struggle with getting quality sleep because their brains are that neurotype, being neurodivergent, are wired to be more active, more engaged. It's harder for that neurodivergent brain to settle into restorative sleep. So that's an area where a neurodivergent person is gonna fight you more for because the brain's like, no, I gotta if I don't rest and sleep, I'm so much more dysregulated. It's a safety issue. It comes down to safety. I'm not safe. I'm not, you know, my health is compromised. And it's so important for couples to recognize it's okay to be different. It's okay to be different. Even so many people have stopped even sharing bedrooms and they may start off in the same, but one goes to sleep in the other. And that's okay. That is not just accommodating and it's not giving up what you want just because your expectations are this. If the outcome of a closer, connected, more regulated, both of you being more regulated, then isn't that positive? Isn't that what you want?
I think that's beautifully said. Like when the goal is connection and safety, then expectations can be thrown out the window and it's like what works for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't have like sleeping in different beds doesn't mean our marriage is over. It's like we have different needs. Maybe somebody snores, maybe somebody I can I can be an active sleeper sometimes. I have active dreams, and but it's not always safe in the bed when I'm
Yeah, we have a pillow between us sometimes, like one of those long pillows, because he's punched me and I'm
I
sleeping.
I play sports in my sleep sometimes. I try to catch a ball and
Laughing because I can relate to this so much. My ex-husband was 6'4", and so he's all elbows and legs, and he had restless legs and also something called periodic limb movement disorder, which means he just like would kick or elbow. And he also, when we were talking about the sheets, he was a very active sleeper, and the sheets could end up in a ball at the foot of the bed, like a little bitty ball by morning, and like we're totally uncovered at all. So I'm like huddled on these. We had a king size bed, thank God, but I'm huddled on the side the whole night long. And after my divorce, see, my expectation going in was similar to yours, Lauren, of, we're snuggling, we're cuddling, all night long. And after 19 years, cuddling, after my divorce, I realized how much that was dysregulating me, that we just kept on keeping on. And then I'd buy heavy covers because I am someone I don't quite need a weighted blanket, but I need heavier, thicker covers on my body. So I'd buy all these heavy covers to try to keep it from all ending up in a wad at the bottom. And then it was just still a disaster. And we never really fought about that, but I realized how much it was impacting my health. It was probably I'm sure it was impacting his as well. And but a lot of couples do end up fighting over these things, and it's so freeing, like you said, Lauren. It's so freeing to let go of the expectations of what should be, what's supposed to be. Because, like you said, nobody really cares what you're doing in your own bedroom in your own house. And if you are content and fulfilled and connected and regulated and healthy, that's the goal. That's really the ultimate goal.
yeah.
Beautiful.
I just realized something that as you were saying, like how we can respond to ourselves, I realized something else that helped my anxiety is I used to hate Mondays. Like all weekend, I'd be so nervous and afraid of Mondays. And what it was I was afraid that I'd be overwhelmed throughout the week. I wouldn't make it through my week because I'd be too
Mhm.
overwhelmed. I wouldn't be able to do my job. And I just realized, like, as we've and that's gone away, but it's really responding to understanding my capacity. And as I've attuned and responded to my needs and made space for me to take breaks, to recharge, that trauma response of you're going to be overwhelmed, you're going to push yourself too hard, you're not going to make it, has gone away because I found safety in the attuning. And so like that's kind of both of my neurodivergence needs has lower capacity, so needs to be accommodated for it. And as I've accommodated for it, I've been able to
Mhm.
meet the needs of my neurodivergence, and it hasn't continued to trigger that trauma response.
The accommodation leads to the healing.
Yep.
Uh,
Mm.
and
Well,
Lauren, from yours, well, go
I,
ahead, Luke.
I was just to say, I don't know if it's even healing in the sense of it's not healing, but it's ending this trauma cycle. It's a
So I guess
nuanced,
that comes down to semantics because
yeah, it
what you
probably
just
is.
described is my definition of healing, but what is yours? What's your
Well,
definition of healing?
yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought about that because as this is a thought that is very new. Actually, it just came to my mind as you said you healed. I was like, I didn't heal. I just stopped a trigger response. But that is healing in some ways. But I
Yeah.
didn't heal my neurodivergence. I
Oh,
stopped the resp
no,
No,
no.
so
Yeah.
that's and I know that's not what you're saying. Yeah, I guess it's the foundation of what's caused that anxiety isn't healed, but it was accommodated so I don't have the anxieties.
Well, I would say that the foundation of what was causing it is not something that needs to be healed. That's your neurotype.
Right.
But the constant inability to respond to the what your body needs is what's caused the trauma. So the
Yeah,
inability or the expectations, the pressure to not give your body what it needs leads to the trauma response. And then once you've
that
got
was healed.
so that
Yeah.
when the trauma
Okay.
response is not happening anymore, then that is healing. I wanted to ask you, as Luke was describing, the more that the two of you have been responsive to his needs during the week, like his capacity needs where he can take breaks, that fear of Mondays, again, fear, the fear of becoming overwhelmed on Mondays has disappeared because you both have responded, accommodated to his needs. What was that like for you, Lauren, to be able to respond and accommodate what Luke's capacity needs are during the week?
Mhm. Mhm. I actually had something else that's so connected to what you just said, so it's so intuitive, your question. Um, I am a bit grieved that it took my children. I'm just thinking of this whole conversation we're having about learning to accommodate things that can be accommodated, that are appropriate to be
Mm-hmm.
accommodated. We didn't really get into it this conversation, but we talked about it in the other part of the series. Luke and I talked about it, and then we had a episode on Jodi's podcast where we also talked about it there, so you guys can check that out too. But the idea of abusive behaviors are not something to accommodate. Abusive,
Mm-hmm.
unhealthy, um, manipulative, coercion, all of those types of behaviors are not something we would want to accommodate in ourselves or in our partner. So that's just so that everyone can hear that. But
Yes.
as I saw these really, really hard behaviors in my kids, like when kids are safe, those behaviors can come out. Like Luke said, he didn't feel the safety or the ability to not unmask and say, I'm so anxious. However, a kid says that lots of different ways. He couldn't do that. Well, our kids have been able to do that, thankfully. And also, it's a lot more work when kids can show their true experience. Of course, I'm glad they did. But all that to say is, the behaviors in my kids to not, quote, being okay with the neurotypical expectations of the world and of myself were so extreme that I couldn't not see them. Like there was no way to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
deny them or to
Mm-hmm.
justify them or ignore them. Whereas in Luke, because he was such a skilled masker
Mm-hmm.
and such a amazing guy who wanted desperately to be a good dad, to be a good partner, and to be, quote, cooperative. For years, I didn't see how much suffering he had. He was under trying to be basically neurotypical. But my kids, they didn't try, like they didn't do that. And so I felt like my kids, and a lot of people might relate to this, that kind of woke me up as the neurotypical, the demanding
Mm-hmm.
neurotypical in the family system of we have to do it this way. It's like I started letting those things go with my kids first.
Mm-hmm.
And that eventually got me to like, I'm letting go, letting go, letting go. And I turn around and what's right in front of me is this like amazing man who I had way too high expectations and was perpetuating his struggle to try to mask and be neurotypical. So all that to say is like I wish in hindsight, I wish that I had seen the more subtle things in him. Not to say I didn't see them all, because I was pretty aware of, I was like hyper attuned in a lot of ways, but I just wish that I had had the insight then to notice, even though he's functioning on the outside, your neurodivergent partner may not be okay on the inside, and they don't, it shouldn't just take like the crazy behaviors of my kids to show us that something is very imbalanced and there needs to be accommodation here so that the person can be their, most thriving self, can be their most authentic self.
Lauren, I think that your experience is just such a common one, though, because we can't know what we don't know. We can't. It's like not even knowing what to investigate until we do. And I know I can relate to that absolutely wholeheartedly. And my marriage ended up I had I had the kids too, who it was so obvious, unfilteredly, so unfiltered. They so I know exactly what you're talking about. And in my marriage, there just wasn't enough capacity on either of our parts to gain that insight. And there were a lot of other layers there too, which a lot of couples are dealing with. It's not just about neurodivergence. There's a lot of other layers that my marriage, I don't think would have survived even if we had have had that insight. But I think it's important for you to cut yourself some slack, because you can't know what you don't know. It's like you don't know if your child, for let's go back to the child example, you don't know your child needs glasses because you can't see through their eyes until something brings that to light. And then you can't feel guilty because you didn't get your child glasses, because you couldn't know. They can't know to tell you that they're not seeing what everybody else is seeing, because they don't know. They can't see through your eyes
Right.
either. The most
Hmm.
important thing, I think, is that once you do start to recognize and see that we're really different, that's when it's important to respond to it and to try to learn about it and gain insight and about yourself, about your partner. The same is true for neurodivergent individuals. Once they're probably a lot more aware of being different from others earlier than neurotypicals are aware of someone being neurodivergent. Um, and so and on that note, the last thing I wanted to say too about that is, you mentioned masking, that Luke was such a great masker. Masking is nothing more than accommodating. It's, masking is accommodating expectations, accommodating what others expect of you. So a lot of people, masking gets a bad rap, and my partner masked. It's not about deception. It's not about bait and switch. It's not about trying to fool you.
Yeah.
It's about, I'm trying to be what you expect and meet your expectations. But there comes a point where I've hit capacity and I can't do that every day or all the time. And then neurotypical partners feel duped, and it's not about that. It's more about, when we get married and go through life and then have children, things shift.
And like masking isn't something I did. It was just what was expected of me. And I didn't know that I wanted to do something else, or that it was dysregulating to do those
Mhm.
things. It wasn't until I started getting language of neurodivergence, I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that, but I forced myself to do that. Or no, I don't like going to crowded areas, but I've pretended like I did because that's what I was supposed to do. And so it's like, yeah, masking is not something like we choose to do consciously. It's just an adaptation to make sure that we fit into the world the best way that we know how to, or the best way that we see others doing it. Yeah.
It's a
And
survival
then
response.
it's such a survival response. Yeah. And it's
Mhm.
automatic. And if it's been so freeing learning how to unmask, because like, um, I feel like I'm getting to know myself more, who I am. Yeah. And as I do that, that's another, it's like accommodating by taking accommodations away. It's I'm trying to fit in, but if as I take away that, I accommodate that, I just can be me, and there is a grief there, but there's also a relief of just like I'm finding
Mhm.
my place where I fit.
I have
Yeah.
one last thing to say, and I know, Lauren, you said you kind of had a wrap up statement too, to respond to what you're saying there. So many neurodiverse couples are also have a lot of codependent dynamics, which is there's an outsourcer sometimes and a helper caregiver. And when you talked about, just now, Luke, you're talking about masking as a survival response. Codependent giver also is masking as a form of survival response.
Yeah.
And you said, I need to get in touch with me and figure out, what does my body actually need? That's also, I really want people who are listening who are feeling so resentful of their neurodivergent partner because they've just taken on so much and taken on so much. Were you trained up as a child in some way to deny, dismiss your own needs in order to
Mm.
accommodate someone else? Is this also part of your masking, that you're masking who you are? I know this is
Yeah.
definitely true for me. I identify as a codependent in recovery, and it was hard for me to take my mask off and go, well, who am I? What do I
Yeah.
actually like and want? And then I started a list. I started a list of things I like and things that I inherited from someone else or I took on from someone else.
Mm.
What my body
That's such a
needs,
good
what I
word.
really want. Like you said, I don't really like going out in crowds. I used to think I liked hiking, and then I was like, actually, I really don't. I like being in nature, but I don't
Yeah.
really like the hiking part.
Mhm.
But I thought I did, but it was really
Yeah.
masking.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's a great point. Is we can mask to fit in a neurotypical world, or we can mask in a family system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So we can wrap up this conversation and just so appreciative of your time, Jodi. There are
Yeah.
so many pearls of wisdom in this conversation. It's unreal.
Such a
I
great conversation.
We didn't like answer everyone's, save the world and answer all the questions because there's no answers. There's no solid, like clear path prescription, but there's a path, but there's not a prescription. So hopefully this conversation can help folks have maybe some
Start the
insight.
conversation,
Yeah.
invitation
or
to the
Mm-hmm,
conversation.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really, really valuable. And I just love how you, Jodi, like you kind of demystify this seemingly massive gap between neurotypicals and neurodivergence and really show we're not that different. It's like
Right.
paradox, right? There's these
Yeah.
significant differences that matter so much, and we can honor and understand and care for them.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we are all just humans.
Just human beings.
Our
Mm-hmm,
needs
mm-hmm,
are like the same, and we can learn so much from each other as we are all on our own path of healing. That's what I've loved about all your
mm-hmm,
work. It's not just the neurodivergent who needs to grow, it's the neurotypical who needs to grow. And we all have
mm-hmm.
these areas, adaptations that need to be shed off and step into our more full authentic self. Like there's no one who doesn't have that as their journey. And
Right.
Yeah.
it's really
That's right.
encouraging and
Yeah. Well,
exciting.
I love this conversation, and I just am enjoying so much through the years meeting more people like yourselves and connecting and networking, and I love I love that you're doing a podcast, and I think it's so important. I know for me, and I imagine it's similar for you. I just couldn't contain what I was learning in my own journey to just myself and my clients. And that's why I started my podcast and my blogs, and most people I've met who are doing similar work kind of have that compulsion of we got to let others know because we've learned this. It's been such a journey, and
Yeah.
I tell people I'm only an expert in that I'm a little bit ahead of you down the path.
Right.
I learned so much from all of my clients, all the people I talk to, but it's just because I'm a little bit farther down the path than you.
Good.
Yeah. We started a podcast because we're like, we talk about this anyways. Might as well record it and let other people listen in.
Exactly. Because they will benefit from it for sure.
Yeah.
Why don't you
So
share where people can find you, Jodi, and yeah, keep people connected to your work.
Yeah, sure. So my website, jodicarlton.com. And if you can just drop that in the show notes so that people can spell my name, Jodi. That's helpful. So you can find all of my resources there. I have a blog. I have a lot of my videos are embedded into the blogs. Um, my podcast is there, but you can find it on any platform. It's called Your Neurodiverse Relationship. I have a YouTube channel. Just if you search for Jodi Carlton, you'll probably find me. If not, add the word neurodivergence or neurodiversity and you will. And so my podcast is a video cast as well. But on the way, well, there's a Facebook group that you guys just joined me in as being an admin. And I love that you've joined me. It's been great. Where both neurotypical and neurodivergent partners and relationships can be there and have conversations about just learning and growing together. And the group is just great. We don't allow venting and bashing. It's just got to be growth oriented. But yeah, so you can find all of that on my website too. You can links to all of that on my website.
And Jodi has amazing quizzes. And I mean, her resources are incredible. She has been doing this for a while and she's really built some wonderful things for folks. And she also offers coaching and assessment. So definitely check her out, follow her, and yeah, check out her podcast. She's doing a series right now on actually interviewing neurodiverse couples, which is
it's can neurodiverse relationships work? And I'm telling you, you guys are on there. I had the best conversations because there's so much doom and gloom around it. But the reality is there's a lot of people who are really finding fulfillment. And the whole season, I think there's about 12 couples that talk about how they went through that journey of discovery and how they've made it work and they're fulfilled. And so going back to the ingredients of what makes a neurodiverse relationship work, it's not just about figuring out the neurodiversity. There's a lot of other layers too. And so I think that it'll be really helpful to help people really look at, do we have these ingredients or not? And it's never just about the neurodiversity. That's one of the layers and a really important one.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't
Well,
wait
thank
to.
you so much for having me. I've loved this conversation. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Jodi. And we will see you next time on the Field of Flourish podcast.